Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the impact that Donald Trump taking over as the US president has had on Russia's income. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that Donald Trump has been very proactive in terms of trying to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. He's actually changed the US's position. Previously, Joe Biden was providing lots of support to Ukraine, and so it was very much a stalemate situation with very slow progress in terms of any sort of peace settlement. However, since he's been in power, Donald Trump has actually stopped all future aid to Ukraine, and he's actually switched off their access to US intelligence services. And these represent serious problems from Ukraine's point of view in terms of the continued funding of the war and also what's going on the battleground. And that's putting a lot of pressure onto Europe and the other Western allies to actually fund more of the finance needed by Ukraine. And President Putin has had a conversation with Donald Trump. And this was the first time for over 3 years that the leaders of the two countries have actually spoken. So Donald Trump is doing a lot to try to bring this war to an end. And interestingly, it was recently reported that the USA is currently working out how quickly the sanctions that are in place against Russia can be lifted if the war does come to some form of peaceful conclusion. However, on the same day that that was reported, Donald Trump posted on his Truth social media platform that he was considering increasing the sanctions that are in place against Russia. So as you can see, there are a lot of things happening very quickly here. Donald Trump is not hanging around. And I know that a lot of you don't follow his posts on Truth Social. So let's have a look at exactly what he said in terms of those potential sanctions against Russia. However, before we have a look at that wording, when I went onto the Truth Social website and looked at Donald Trump's posts, I found this one, which is a picture of his face and Elvis Presley's face merged together. There's no actual wording, he didn't say anything about it, and I just wonder what the mindset is, why he's actually posted that picture, what he's actually trying to say. I don't really get it. But anyway, in terms of what he posted on the 7th of March relating to the Russian sanctions, he said, based on the fact that Russia is absolutely pounding Ukraine on the battlefield right now, I am strongly considering large-scale banking sanctions and tariffs on Russia until a ceasefire and final settlement agreement on peace is reached. So Russia and Ukraine, get to the table right now before it is too late. So in terms of the message here, it's very clear. Donald Trump wants a peace agreement to be signed, and he wants to try to force all of the parties into doing so. So he's cut off all of the Ukraine aid, and he's also now saying to Russia, if you don't come around the table, if you don't agree to the peace settlement, then I will put more and more sanctions on Russia until you get to the point where you will be forced to do that. And I guess the key question to ask here is, would that make any difference to Russia? Would additional sanctions actually hurt the Russian economy? Because as it stands at the moment, there are currently over 20,000 individual sanctions that have been applied against Russia over the past 3 years. So Russia is already facing a tsunami of sanctions, so can any more actually make any difference? I'm not sure whether or not they can, because most of the big ones are already in place. You could lower the price cap on Russian oil to less than $60 and $100 for refined products, but enforcing that has proved to be difficult for the West. However, I think what's happening with regards to what Donald Trump is doing elsewhere in his presidency actually could have a huge impact on Russia's income and their desire to actually bring the war in Ukraine to an end. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about NordVPN, who I've partnered with for today's video, and who are offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 4 months extra on a 2-year plan. Now, if you follow the channel, you'll know that I personally have been a victim of cybercrime. This channel was hacked and taken over by cybercriminals. And if I'd have been using NordVPN at that point, it would never have happened, because NordVPN contains a unique feature called Threat Protection Pro, which would have prevented the cybercriminals being able to hack my account. So NordVPN is fantastic for protecting you every single time you go online, making sure that nobody can hack into your accounts or steal your password or steal any money from you. But it's also amazing for opening up a world of entertainment, because you can access movies and TV shows and sports events that you're geo-blocked from. You can change your location and access all of that entertainment and information. And the fantastic news is that NordVPN is offering Joe Blogs viewers an exclusive 40% discount on a 2-year plan, which you can access by going to nordvpn.com/joeblogs or clicking in the link in the description below. And the great news is that NordVPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee. As I'm sure you'll be aware, since taking over as the president, Donald Trump has decided that he wants to introduce a variety of tariffs on the USA's biggest trading partners. At the beginning of February, he announced a 10% tariff on all imports from China, and that was on top of the 25% tariff that he introduced in his first presidency. And also, as I'm sure you'll be aware, all electric vehicles being imported from China now have a 100% tariff. And then at the beginning of March, he announced that he was increasing the 10% tariff to 20%. And in retaliation, China has now hit a lot of US imports, mainly agricultural products, with either tariffs of 10 or 15%. And Donald Trump has also announced 25% tariffs against Canada and Mexico. Now, those tariffs have actually been put on hold at the moment until the beginning of April, but they're still hanging over both of those nations. And in retaliation, Mexico and Canada have also announced that they're increasing tariffs on US exports. And what these announcements have done is sent the global markets into shock. We have seen stock markets tumbling. We're seeing the share price of lots of American businesses falling because we're going to see rising prices in the USA. We're going to see increasing inflation, and that's likely to force the Fed to increase interest rates. And all of that is bad news for the US economy. It's also bad news for the Chinese economy because the US is its largest export market, and also Mexico and Canada are in the same situation. So Donald Trump is currently causing major problems in the global economy, and everybody's very worried about what the long-term impact will be, certainly through the rest of 2025. And what that's done to oil prices is sent them down. And the reason why this is having a major impact on the Russian economy is because Russia is totally dependent on oil and gas revenues still. Around 30% of Russia's GDP is directly derived from oil and gas revenues, and 50% of the central government revenue comes directly from those sources. And when we get a fall in oil prices, what that's going to mean is that Russia's total revenue is going to go down. And obviously, that's going to be bad news for the long-term viability of the Russian economy. This chart shows the movement in the price of Brent crude oil over the past 6 months. And what this shows is that on January the 15th, 5 days before Donald Trump took over as the president, Brent crude oil was trading for $82 per barrel. And as you can see, that was the highest price that it had traded at any time in this 6-month period. However, if we look at what's happened to the price of Brent crude oil since Donald Trump took over as the president, it has been in a severe downward trend. And the current price of around $70 per barrel represents a fall of 15%. And as we've just discussed, the reason why this is really critical to the Russian economy is because Russia is totally dependent on oil revenue, and that oil revenue is dependent on the oil price. This chart shows the movement in Russia's oil and gas revenues over the past 5 years, and the scale on the left-hand side of this chart is shown in trillions of Russian rubles. And it also compares what's been happening with the price of Russian oil and Brent crude oil, which are shown by the 2 lines on this chart. So if we start off by looking at what's happened to Russia's income from oil and gas, you can see that in 2020, Russia earned 8 trillion Russian rubles from the sale of oil and gas, and the exchange rate to US dollars at that time was around 72 to $1 US, so the US dollar equivalent was around $110 billion. And as you can see from the orange line, which shows the average price of Russian crude oil, in that year, Russian crude oil was trading for around $42 per barrel. And interestingly, you can see that there wasn't really any differential between the price of Russian oil and Brent crude oil back in 2020. This is before the war started in Ukraine and all the sanctions were applied against Russia. In 2021, which was the last full year that was unaffected by the war in Ukraine, Russia earned 9 trillion rubles from the sale of oil and gas, and you can see that the average price of Russian oil in that year was $69. So the increase year on year was predominantly driven by the increase in the price per barrel that Russia was selling its oil for. And in terms of the US dollar equivalent, at that time, $1 was trading for around 74 rubles, so the total income equated to around 122 billion US dollars. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, the invasion of Ukraine commenced in February 2022, and that's when a lot of the sanctions were applied against Russia. And you can see that there was a huge divergence in the price of Brent crude oil, shown by the green dotted line, and Russian oil, which is shown by the orange line. And that was because a lot of countries stopped dealing with Russia, and so Russia had to offer discounts to new trading partners such as China and India to persuade them to take on the risk of buying more Russian oil. Now, I think one of the interesting points to note here is that despite the fact that all of these sanctions were applied against Russia, total income from oil and gas sales actually increased to 11.6 trillion rubles, predominantly as a result of the fact that the average price of a barrel of Russian oil increased to $76. And one of the main reasons why the price of Russian oil increased was because the price of Brent crude oil increased to almost $100. So although Russian oil was trading at a discount, because overall oil prices were going up and demand for oil was high, Russia benefited from selling its oil at a higher rate. As I'm sure you'll be aware if you follow the channel, the exchange rate in 2022 was all over the place. At one point, it dropped to less than 120 rubles to $1, and then strengthened to around 50 when the Russian central bank stepped in and started buying rubles, supporting the ruble in the markets. And the average price over that year was estimated to be around 69 rubles to $1. So the US dollar equivalent of the income that Russia earned in 2022 was around $169 billion, which was the highest out of any year on this chart. If we now look at what happened in 2023, you can see that the average price of a barrel of Russian oil actually fell to $63 during the year. And once again, the main reason why it fell was because the general price of Brent crude oil also fell to around $80. So there was still that differential between Russian oil and Brent crude oil. So as Brent fell in value, so did the Russian oil. And you can see that that had a really detrimental impact on Russia's total income from oil and gas, which fell to 8.8 trillion rubles, which was less than what Russia had earned in 2021. And interestingly, because the exchange rate of the ruble fell so dramatically, on average in 2023, it was trading for around 80 to $1. Total revenue fell to less than 110 billion US dollars, which is actually the lowest out of every year on this table, so lower than 2020. And if we now look at what happened in 2024, you can start to get a feel for the impact that the movement in Russian oil price has on total revenue. The average price of a barrel of Russian oil in 2024 was $70. And once again here, you can see that the movement in the price of Russian oil was directly related to what was happening to the price of Brent oil, which increased to around $85 per barrel during the year. And as a result of that price increase, total revenue from oil and gas increased to 10.3 billion rubles. And at an average exchange rate of 85 rubles to $1 during the year, that equated to 121 billion US dollars, which is the second highest amount that Russia has earned in these 5 years. The only year that it earned more was in 2021, and that was only 1 billion more. As we discussed earlier, since Donald Trump took over as the president, Brent crude oil prices have fallen by 15%, and that's had a direct impact on the price of Russian oil. This chart shows the movement in the price of Russian oil over the past 6 months, and what this shows is that on the 15th of January, Russian oil was actually trading at $77. However, over the course of the past couple of months, we have seen the price of Russian oil falling dramatically, and it's now trading at around $65. And if we widen the scale of this chart to show what's been happening over the past 5 years, you can see that the current level is one of the lowest that Russian oil has been selling at since the invasion of Ukraine started. And the 16% fall in the value of Russian oil that's been seen over the last 6 weeks will have a direct impact on the total revenue that Russia is receiving. As the price of each barrel goes down, then Russia will be losing lots of revenue, and this potentially could represent serious bad news for the Russian economy for the rest of 2025 if oil prices continue falling. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with regards to Donald Trump and all of his policies is having a really big impact on the whole of the global economy. This is one of the reasons why I started this channel, to talk about how one decision can have serious knock-on implications all across the globe. So Donald Trump saying that he's going to apply tariffs against China, Mexico and Canada as a result of what he says is the war on drugs. He believes that a lot of the fentanyl that's entering into the USA is being produced in China, and then Canada and Mexico are letting people cross the border to bring those drugs into the country. So he said that he's going to apply those tariffs to stop all of that drug trade. But what we're seeing here is a serious knock-on implication to lots of other parts of the world. And what we talked about in today's video is that the implication of introducing those additional tariffs is that we've seen stock markets starting to fall, and everybody is becoming nervous about what's happening with regards to the US economy, the Chinese economy, and the global economy. And we are now concerned that there could be a global slowdown and potentially even a global recession. This could be a black swan event, one of those things that you don't really think is going to have a huge impact, but all of a sudden there's a massive domino impact that everything starts to fall into place and everything starts to fall apart. And that's what we're seeing with regards to oil prices. They have come down significantly, and I think oil prices are a really good barometer as to what's happening in the global economy. Generally speaking, when the globe's doing well, there is high demand for oil, and therefore oil prices goes up. And when there is a slowdown in the global economy, there's a slowdown in the demand for oil, and so oil prices fall. Now, obviously, OPEC are trying to adjust that. They tend to reduce the supply of oil to try to keep prices high, but that usually only works for a short space of time. And what we're seeing here is oil prices have come down, and it's likely that if the globe does go into recession, if there is a slowdown in global trade and the economies start to go towards a recession situation individually, then oil prices are likely to continue tumbling. They could go down to $50 or $40 or even lower. And if that does happen, it's going to represent an absolute disaster from Russia's point of view. As we saw from the data earlier, Russia is directly linked to what's happening with its oil price. When oil prices go up, then generally speaking, Russia's revenue goes up. When oil prices go down, so does its revenue. And that's happened even in the face of all of the sanctions. We've seen that in 2022, 23 and 24, the biggest influence on what's happening with Russia's income is the movement in the oil price. So if oil prices go down in 2025 and have a prolonged period where they are low, that is going to really hurt Russia, because 30% of its GDP comes from the sale of oil and gas, and 50% of the revenue that the Kremlin is receiving is coming directly from those sources. So if oil prices fall by 10, 15 or 20%, then Russian revenue will also fall by 10, 15 or 20%. In fact, it may fall at an accelerating rate because Russia has a lot of fixed costs that it needs to keep paying. So when the price per barrel goes down, then all of your cut in price tends to go straight through to the bottom line. So Russia will really suffer if oil prices stay at a prolonged low level during 2025. So interestingly, Donald Trump, who's trying to force Russia around the table by saying that he's going to introduce additional sanctions, is probably going to have a bigger impact on President Putin's decision by what he's doing with China, Mexico and Canada, because the unintended implication of that is that oil prices are now going down, and that will definitely hurt the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.